In part two of this lecture, we want to return to our question about how the actual structure of a molecule, the types and arrangements of atoms and bonds, makes that molecule a strong or weak acid or base. In particular, this time, since we talked about the structures of acids before, we want to concentrate on the structures of bases. Now we know or can recall some examples of strong bases like sodium, potassium, or calcium hydroxide, and weak bases such as the conjugate bases of weak acids. But besides those two, there's an important class of nitrogen-containing bases of varying strength called amines. And so we're going to look at the question of how the structure of a molecule affects how strong or weak a base that molecule can be using the class of molecules called amines as an example. A number of examples of amines are based on the structure of the weak base ammonia. So right here I've drawn the Lewis structure of ammonia. Notice the lone pair of electrons on the nitrogen. If ammonia reacts with water, it forms the ammonium ion and hydroxide. And of course, we've talked about this equilibrium before. Ammonia is acting as a weak base in water and forming hydroxide in the ammonium ion. And it has a Kb value of 1.8 times 10 to the minus 5. So what we're asking here is, how could we make this lone pair of electrons more attractive to H plus ions? Because that is where ammonia is acting as a base. That lone pair of electrons on the nitrogen is acting as the H plus acceptor. So we're asking, could we change the structure of this molecule in such a way to make that lone pair more attractive to hydrogen ions, or a more powerful H plus acceptor, also known as a better base? Well, one thing we could do is substitute one or more of the hydrogen atoms with electron donors. These would be atoms or groups of atoms that push electron density toward the nitrogen atom. Hydrocarbon fragments, such as methyl groups, which would be a carbon and 3 hydrogens, or ethyl groups, 2 carbons and 5 hydrogens, can act as electron donating groups. So here's an example of using a methyl group. So what we've done here is we've substituted for hydrogen here, we've substituted a methyl group. So this is called methylamine. And in water, this would act similarly to ammonia. It would abstract an H plus from water and form a cation. This time it would be called the methyl ammonium ion. And we could write an equilibrium with just formulas like this: CH3NH2 plus water forming CH3NH3 plus. That's the result of abstracting an H plus from water, resulting in a hydroxide in a basic solution. The Kb of methylamine is 4.4 times 10 to the minus 4. So it is a more, we should say, a stronger weak base than simply ammonia. So in fact, in water solution, methylamine is about 24 times as basic as ammonia. So what we say here is the electron donating methyl group. Right here you can see the arrows, the purple arrows where the methyl group is pushing electron density toward the nitrogen. It makes that nitrogen lone pair more attractive to H plus and also helps stabilize the resulting positive charge that occurs when H plus does attach at this lone pair of electrons. So the electron donating methyl group pushes electron density toward that lone pair, making it more attractive to an H plus, also stabilizing the methyl ammonium product And so methylamine is a stronger base than ammonia. Well, if adding one methyl group enhances the basicity, how about adding some more? Well, recall that ammonia has this structure and has a Kb value of 1.8 times 10 to the minus 5. When we added the methyl group, it's a better base because it's a larger Kb value. And we have a picture here again of the methyl group donating electron density or pushing electron density toward this lone pair on the nitrogen. So adding one methyl group clearly increases Kb. Well, how about if we add even more? Let's add two methyl groups. This would be dimethylamine, meaning two methyl groups on a basic amine structure. And the Kb here is 5.4 times 10 to the minus 4. So now we have two methyl groups donating electron density toward that nitrogen lone pair, and adding a second methyl group does slightly increase the Kb value from methylamine. Now let's add a third methyl group. So now we have three methyl groups donating electron density toward that nitrogen lone pair. And surprise, surprise, adding a third methyl group decreases the Kb value. In other words, suddenly this is a worse base. Well, this seems a little counterintuitive. Why would the presence of three electron donating methyl groups suddenly make the electron pair on the nitrogen atom less attractive to a hydrogen ion? Well, it turns out that when amines accept H plus ions, there are some structural rearrangements that need to take place. And in this case, the presence of three methyl groups introduces some crowding, some spatial crowding, which makes these required structural rearrangements more difficult. If you do take organic chemistry in the future, this type of challenge will be referred to as a steric effect. In any event, with trimethylamine, these steric effects more than offset the electronic effects of the three electron donating methyl groups. In other words, yes, this lone pair probably is innately now much more attractive to an H plus, but the steric problem here, the crowding problem, will make it more difficult for an H plus to approach this molecule, and so therefore it suddenly becomes a weaker base. So you might ask, do I expect you to recognize these types of steric effects? And the answer is not really, but you should be able to appreciate the fact that the strength of any particular amine, again, amine is a class of compounds with this type of structure, nitrogen lone pair of electrons and this type of structure, that the strength of any particular amine, meaning its base strength, depends on the type and arrangement of atoms or groups of atoms attached to the nitrogen atom. Let's look at a few other types of amines on the next slide. This is a table from the textbook that you'll have available for quizzes and exams. And we have referred to before. It's a table of Kb values for some bases. And we've already discussed four of these. We've discussed ammonia, methylamine, dimethylamine, and trimethylamine. Let's take a brief look at a couple others. How about ethylamine and hydroxylamine? Well, ethylamine is on the list right here. It has the formula C2H5NH2, which I have down here. And basically what's going on here is that there is an ethyl group, a C2H5 group, attached to the nitrogen. And so this can interact with water, form the ethyl ammonium ion, and hydroxide. And as you can see, the ethylamine is a slightly better base than methylamine. The second one we want to just point out in passing here is hydroxylamine, right here on the list. And hydroxylamine is an ammonia where one of the hydrogens have been substituted off with a hydroxyl group. That's not a hydroxide ion, that's called a hydroxyl group, which you've seen before on carboxylic acids. And just like these other amines, it can interact with water, form the hydroxyl ammonium ion and hydroxide. You'll see that hydroxylamine has a pretty low Kb value, which tells me that actually what's going on here is the hydroxide is withdrawing electron density from the nitrogen, making this lone pair act as a weaker base. And just a note here, I did not show the lone pairs on the oxygen of the hydroxyl group. This hydroxylamine acts as a base through the lone pair on the nitrogen anyway. Here we have a couple left to cover here. Here's our list. Let's look at aniline. Aniline is an interesting molecule. It's this benzene ring, an aromatic, which we've seen before, which can be symbolized by this hexagon with alternate double and single bonds. These are various ways to show the structure of aniline. In all of these, you can see there's a nitrogen lone pair. So this is in a class of amines and can be considered an ammonia derivative. Aniline is a pretty weak base. Here's the equation that you might see instead of structures here. So aniline plus water forming this anilinium ion, kind of a funny name, plus hydroxide. If you were asked to write a Kb expression for any of these amines, you would do this just like you would for any base. The product of the concentrations of the products divided by the concentration of the reactant at equilibrium, and the Kb values listed in the table. How about pyridine? Well, pyridine is a fairly weak base also. Interestingly, pyridine is a six-membered ring, but one of the carbons has been substituted with a nitrogen. The nitrogen has a lone pair, which can act as an H plus acceptor. And if we were going to write an equation describing that, pyridine plus water forming the pyridinium ion plus hydroxide. And finally on the list of things we haven't covered yet, hydrazine. It's kind of a weird looking molecule. It's two NH2 groups attached through a nitrogen. So you can see there's actually two lone pairs here. If we write that interacting with water, the water would donate an H plus to either one of the lone pairs. We'd have the hydrazinium ion and hydroxide. Now in theory, we can write this chemistry for hydrazine. In practice, since hydrazine is highly toxic and dangerous, you'll probably not ever be making that solution. So in summary, we've looked at a series of weak bases. All of these bases were in the class of compounds called amines, which can all be seen as derivatives of ammonia. And the strength of these amine bases depends typically on what's attached to it, whether it's that attachment is donating electrons and making that lone pair more attractive to an H plus, or somehow withdrawing electrons, making that lone pair less attractive to hydrogen ions. You'll be seeing some of these structures of some of these compounds in future lectures.